Captain Buckingham, the SAS, Crack Commando Squad.
While the British toy company Palitoy had long been in business making action figures targeted at the young male demographic, their contributions in the 1980s can largely be remembered through their production of the toy line known as Action Force. The initial lineup in 1982 served as a downsized recreation of their long-standing 12-inch scaled Action Man brand that had been on the market since 1966. And this revised 3 3/4-inch size toy line would transition some of the more popular, already existing Action Man sets into a smaller scale that could more directly compete with Kenner's Star Wars range, as Star Wars was already in that smaller scale and was dominating its competition in toy sales across the globe. 1983 would then see a transition of Action Force into a more fantasy-based, story-driven brand. This would be accompanied by an ongoing comic series published by IPC magazines to help breathe some life into our fictional characters. Additionally, the Action Force heroes themselves would be segmented into 4 operational-based teams, taking on an enemy team known as the Red Shadows, who were led by the maniacal Baron Ironblood. Thus, starting in 1983, the heroic teams would consist of Z Force for land-based combat, Q Force for subaquatic missions, Space Force for handling threats in the Earth's orbit, and the SAS, an elite group of commandos and secret mission operatives. And it is this latter grouping that forms the subject of today's video, so stay tuned for the history of Palitoy's Action Force SAS. Let's begin.
The history of the SAS goes right back to World War II, the Special Air Service. But where they kind of really became into the public eye was in the 1980s when there was the Iranian Embassy in Britain was under siege, and the SAS were sent in to put an end to the siege, essentially. And that was broadcast live on the news. And people all over Britain and Ireland, or anyone who could get the BBC, was watching that live as that was happening. And for me, as a young kid who was really into soldiers, I was absolutely glued to the TV, seeing the SAS troopers kind of rappel down the side of the building. A lot of explosions, kind of happening. There was smoke coming out of the windows. I am Brian Hickey. I am the owner of Total Toy Books. I'm a designer, photographer, and publisher of books about vintage toys.
You can find Brian's publications both at the TotalToyBooks.com as well as the Skeletron.com websites. Buy these books today to learn more about some of the Palitoy-driven brands that form such an important part of British toy history as well as comics history. Naturally, Palitoy recognized the rising public awareness of the SAS in the wake of their successful televised mission at the Iranian Embassy in 1980, where they rescued a group of hostages from the gunmen who had stormed the embassy just several days earlier. As such, Palitoy would go on to incorporate SAS uniforms into their well-established, ongoing 12-inch scaled Action Man line in the early 1980s. And as Palitoy would go on to develop their downscaled Action Force toy line, which capitalized on the most popular uniforms from the larger Action Man scale, it only made sense to have some SAS representation in this new scale as well. Thus, the first series of Action Force in 1982 would have a representation of both a more generic SAS figure along with an SAS frogman. But Action Force would need to evolve from its initial roots as a downscaled version of Action Man. And as told by former Palitoy chief designer Bob Brechin in Total Action Force The Battle Years, management changes and a new marketing team in 1982 would see Action Force shift towards a more sci-fi and fantastical direction going forward. And the SAS would have a big role in this next phase of Action Force.
When Series 2 was developed in 1983 of Action Force, the SAS got its whole team, like a whole lineup with different members and different vehicles.
The SAS, joined by the aforementioned Z Force, Q Force, and Space Force, would collectively find themselves in new adventures battling against the Red Shadow's enemy team. And to bring the real-life Special Air Service into a fictional, printed form, publisher IPC Magazines would hire the services of an experienced writer and comics legend for their Battle Action Force series.
The SAS, being such a main team within the Action Force lineup, when the comics were rolled out, Jerry Finley-Day did a brilliant job of bringing the SAS Force characters to life. Jerry's writing style was perfect for SAS Force. You look back over his kind of comic book history, and you see that Jerry, he loved the idea of a team or a squad and bringing individual personalities to life within that team. Way back in the 1970s, he had a comic strip called The Sarge, which followed a squad battling their way up from North Africa and up through Italy. And he had these great kind of personalities, within the overall squad. With The Sarge, he's a more mature, kind of veteran, and he's looking out for his squad. And then later he would use a similar kind of dynamic with his classic comic series, Rogue Trooper. And for those who aren't familiar with it, Rogue Trooper is a future war story, which really, the best Rogue Trooper stories are the ones that Jerry Finley-Day told when he originated the whole concept. And again, he's got that squad dynamic. And so when Jerry was given the task of bringing the Action Force comic series to life, he chose SAS Force to fit that kind of model. And you don't really see that model applied in Jerry's Z-Force stories. He keeps that much more about military strategy than kind of, like a squad kind of dynamic. But with SAS Force, he really dived into that. So you've got Captain Rob Buckingham is the commander of the squad, and he's the veteran. He's kind of the slightly older, but certainly a lot wiser than any of the rest of the guys in the team. His right-hand man is Trooper Jones, codename Stakeout, and he's from Liverpool. He's got a wicked sense of humour. He derives pleasure out of making fun of other people on the squad. He's a character, some people love him, some people hate him, but he's steadfastly loyal to Buckingham, the commander. And then you've got the very opposite of Stakeout is Hans Muller, whose codename is Quickfire, and he's absolutely deadly serious. Well, I think we spoke about this before, Ken, where he's in the mess hall and he's kind of having, he's having his lunch or his dinner, and he's holding his steak knife like it's a bayonet. So that trio forms the nucleus of the SAS Force squad. And the last time we spoke about these guys was in the context of Operation Bloodhound, which is a brilliant story.
We discussed the publication history of the Battle comic and its transition into Battle Action Force as part of our Red Shadows history segment. In doing so, we also brought up the general story of Operation Bloodhound, whereby the SAS pursues Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows across South America. We also touched on Operation Claymore, which is another Jerry Finley-Day story where the SAS are front and center again, but it's worth elaborating on that a little bit more and cover aspects of the storyline that we didn't discuss in that Red Shadows video.
My favourite comic strip for SAS Force would be what I would consider the sequel to Bloodhound, and that is Operation Claymore. And in Claymore we've got a very a slightly different dynamic in that we still have Eagle, or Buckingham, with Stakeout, but they're on training manoeuvres with two new guys, codename Beaver and codename Haggis, join them on a mission, and the two veterans really have to work with these guys and bring them up to speed on a lot of things. You have this fantastic dynamic between the four members of the squad, and two of the characters, you've got Trooper MacDonald's codename Haggis, and then you've got the waterborne specialist Beaver on the team. And Haggis is one of these characters that I see he's become a fan favourite. Haggis was never produced as an actual figure, but over the course of that story, which ran for 14 issues between October 84 and January 85, the readers, us as readers, we got to really love that character. What makes him so special, he's fiercely proud of his Scottish heritage. He's got a hot head and a temper, and I suppose a lot of us as kids could have really related to that at the time. And Trooper Jones, or Stakeout, takes a lot of pleasure in kind of winding him up and getting under his skin. But eventually the two characters kind of put their differences aside and There's a great scene towards the end of the story where they're kind of facing off against the Red Shadows in a last-ditch battle. That's definitely one of my all-time favourite Action Force stories.
The struggles of Buckingham, Stakeout, Beaver, and Haggis are quite palpable in Operation Claymore, as they do their best to work against the infiltration efforts of the Red Shadows in the Scottish Highlands. The SAS make many sacrifices, and as a reader, you might find yourself relating to the characters much like you would in a high-budget television series. Shows like Band of Brothers come to mind when making such comparisons. And while we've given Jerry Finley Day a good level of recognition for his contributions to the Action Force lore, there were other writers who gave us some great stories to go alongside the ones that Jerry wrote. Scott Goodall is one of those names that deserves to be mentioned.
So he would have done the introduction to Beaver, who is the pilot that comes with the silent attack canoe. His introduction was in Battle Action Force, and he had a great little mission where he has to work as a saboteur to take down a Red Shadows base that's in Canada.
This Canadian character is another fan favorite, and is desirable to toy collectors in part due to the fun, small silent attack vehicle that he comes with.
And it has little wheels that only barely protrude from the base, so when you place it down on a surface, it just glides along silently.
In addition to codename Beaver, another fun solo mission by Scott Goodall is the story known as Hawk's Challenge. This one focuses on the pilot known as Blades and his gyrocopter called the Hawk. Blades discovers a very large Red Shadows ammunition and weapons storage in Australia and works to thwart the efforts of the Red Shadows from launching an invasion.
And the Hawk helicopter, again, Joe fans will recognise it as the Fang, but it got a similar kind of colour scheme to the Panther, the black and yellow. The pilot is called Blades, and it's essentially tripwire from the G.I. Joe line, again with the kind of a black and grey, black and yellow SAS Force colour scheme.
And before we shift the discussion towards the toy line, it's also worth pointing out another of the primary writers on Action Force. James Tomlinson, who wrote under the pen name of James Nicholas, wrote some other fantastic stories chronicling Action Force's struggles against the Red Shadows. Codename Kraken is one example of a Red Shadows focused story where the SAS show up for parts of the tale, but James also wrote many others.
You also have Death Castle, which is another great James Tomlinson story, which is almost like a horror movie. It's like something you would see if Hammer Productions were ever to make an Action Force movie, it would be Death Castle.
So we've now discussed the characters in relation to the Battle Action Force comic, and the goal here is to add some depth to the various toy releases that we saw for the SAS team in 1983 and 1984. While we have already talked about the squad leader, also known as Eagle if you prefer his codename, we can still point out a few other things. First, the base figure is nearly identical to that of the 1982 unnamed SAS figure. The key difference is that there's an SAS logo tampoed onto the shoulder of the 1983 figure that's not present on the 1982 version, though that logo does get worn off and it can be easy to mix the figures up. Further, while the squad leader is known as Rob Buckingham in the comic strips, his data file lists his full name as Charles Richard Buckingham. We've also already talked about Stakeout, or Trooper Jones if you prefer, and as a figure, he came packed in with the SAS Boat Patrol.
It's got a little, outboard. It's got the cannon, and then there is also an oar that comes with that too. It's actually a repurposed roof off the Action Force Jeep, converted into like a raft.
If you look at the AF-3 patrol vehicle from 1982, you'll see that the roof of the Jeep has been repurposed and recolored into a water vehicle for Stakeout. Hans Muller, or Quickfire if you prefer, was sold on card as the SAS Commando. Being a German character, you can see that Action Force was very much international hero themed early on in the franchise's existence. Jean-Luc Bouvier, also known as Barracuda, was sold on card and marketed as the SAS team's Frogman. Like Buckingham, he's another who's a slight variation of a 1982 figure, namely the previous SAS Frogman. Now, where this 1983 version has the SAS logo on the front of the figure, the 1982 version does not. Pete Sanderson, an American, had the codename of Chopper and was the SAS team's pilot. Pieter Vanderberg, who's a character from Belgium, used the codename of Sparrowhawk, and is the SAS team's para-attack trooper. A character from Iceland named Ragnar Ragnarsson took on the codename of Stalker. Interestingly, he's a slight redeco of the G.I. Joe Snake Eyes figure, and not to add further confusion, but G.I. Joe already had a character named Stalker, as many of you know. This figure was one example that had both knee and elbow articulation due to its reuse from the G.I. Joe line, unlike the usual 5 points of articulation figures that were dominant in Action Force. Stalker came packaged in with this gorgeous Jeep known as the Panther, which itself is recolored from a classic G.I. Joe vehicle.
G.I. Joe fans will recognise this as being the Vamp, but it got a special kind of, recolored kind of treatment when Palitoy wanted to take that vehicle and adapt it into its Action Force line. And this variant here has got the yellow roll bar on it. There is a different version with the black roll bar.
Case in point, while Brian's Panther has a yellow roll cage, mine has a black colored one. And sometimes it can be fun seeing which variants that your friends have. My friend Will also has a yellow roll cage on his Panther, and note as well, his SAS logo along the side of the vehicle is a sticker, whereas mine is a tampo detail that has been stamped on. Of note, Will bought his Panther on the same day as I did at JoeFest 2024, and we got ours from the same group of sellers. The cool thing is, it really just ended up this way organically, as neither of us were looking for specific variations when we made our purchases. You'll also notice that the wheels on the SAS Panther are different than that of the G.I. Joe Vamp. And a perfect complementary item to the Panther would be the Mobile Missile System, or MMS. This is another that's also been recolored from the original 1982 G.I. Joe MMS. This is a nice add-on to the SAS team, given that it can be attached and towed from the back of the Panther Jeep. And since we've already touched on some variations, it's worth pointing out some packaging style differences within Action Force. For example, my boxed MMS has a window style box, whereas my friend Shane's has a box with a fully enclosed front. As you're seeing, Palitoy would make great use in repurposing existing G.I. Joe vehicles at the time. Another noteworthy example of this is the SAS version of the G.I. Joe Wolverine.
And that got a nice treatment. It's very similar to the Joe version, but it's got that black and yellow kind of scheme to it. And the Cobra officer got recolored, and he is Hunter.
Adding a bit more international diversity, Hunter is Chico Rodriguez from Mexico, and the Wolverine is yet another vehicle that can tow the MMS from behind. We've already gone over Blades, also known as Herbert Rottweiler, and his Hawk vehicle earlier, but it's worth pointing out that long after his release, Blades was brought back as a G.I. Joe 1992 convention figure and distributed under the name Tripwire. We've also already gone over Trooper Smith, aka Beaver, the team's Canadian member, and his silent attack vehicle. As you've seen here, most of the other vehicles were repurposed from the G.I. Joe line or reused from an existing Action Force vehicle. But the silent attack is an exception to this. As a toy, this was the only uniquely tooled vehicle for the SAS team.
The one figure that I particularly like is the SAS Force Attack Trooper, which got released in 1984. And because he came late in the kind of the line's history, that particular figure didn't get a lot of kind of page time in the comics. But when I was doing my research for Total Action Force Volume 3, Bob shared with me all his photos of the prototypes that he had in his possession. And within them was an unproduced US Paratrooper action figure. We did get a US Paratrooper in Action Force Series 1, but there was another version of that wasn't produced, and that version is what would go on to become the SAS Force Attack Trooper.
To round out this discussion, there was also an SAS battle gear set to rearm your troops. Each of the 4 Action Force teams and the enemy team would get a battle gear set. Sadly, with the dissolution of Palitoy's design department in 1984 and eventual closure of the company entirely in the time thereafter, the toy line as we knew it would come to an end. With parent company General Mills moving away from the toy business, their toy division was spun off into a separate company entirely, of which Palitoy was folded into. This company was called Kenner Parker Toys, named after 2 of Palitoy's sister companies when they were all under General Mills. but Kenner Parker would be bought up by another toy company in Tonka in 1987, and then later on, Tonka would be bought up by Hasbro in 1991. That said, let's get back and briefly touch on the 1985 line, because it's still important to talk about Palitoy Action Force's final release year. With in-house design work being made redundant, 1985 would primarily see G.I. Joe toys repackaged as Action Force for many European markets. As such, the era of the 4 Action Force teams and Enemy Team as a toy line became a thing of the past. That said, there was still a re-release of the Silent Attack, albeit repackaged in a different, non-SAS color scheme, and now included Recondo in the place of Beaver. As for the comics overall, the addition of Action Force into IPC's Battle Comics and eventual retitling to Battle Action Force, well, let's just say that Action Force did what it set out to do. While weekly sales dropped from over 100,000 per week at the start of the 1980s to just over 70,000 a week in the immediate time before the arrival of Action Force, sales spiked again to between 80 and 90,000 a week by the mid-1980s. As a comic that was a combination of some colored pages mixed in with some black and white pages, the stories have aged quite well. And even though the Palitoy era of the toy line was done by 1985, the Action Force comic would run until late 1986, where we'd still see some old favorites making appearances.
Even later in the Action Force run, after a lot of the G.I. Joe characters have been introduced into the line, you find SAS Force still making a lot of appearances in the comic strips. So one of my favourites is London in Peril, and that's a story where Cobra essentially attack London, capture the city and hold it to ransom, and Action Force have to send in a squad to try and infiltrate the Cobra lines and try and break the siege. And that team is led by Duke with I think Scarlet and I think Gung Ho or Stalker, and they're accompanied by Rob Buckingham and Stakeout. And they go in with the team, and they each kind of branch off on different missions and then kind of converge again later in the story. So it's great to see in a story like that you get the old and the new figures, or as how they would have been seen at the time, kind of working together and coming together in the story. And similarly to that, there's another great SAS Force strip that's set in South America. It's called Death in South America, and members of SAS Force, again, they're on a training mission, and by pure coincidence at the same time, Cobra are on a training mission in South America as well, led by Major Blood, and both the Cobra squad and the SAS squad are attacked and captured by a third party, and let's say a fantastic story rolls out from there.
As the IPC magazine's era for Action Force drew to a close, Action Force would transfer over to Marvel UK for 1987, in conjunction with the more Hasbro-driven toy line that would become branded as Action Force International Heroes. That said, people would continue to look back at the SAS and all the possibilities we could have had this iteration of Action Force not ended so abruptly in the mid-1980s. As an interesting side note, here's a look at some sketches and an early mock-up done for an unproduced SAS security van. And while many die-hard Action Force fans are already aware of this, it's still worth mentioning the unmade Special Weapons Force that got well into development but stopped short of being mass-produced. Here, we would have seen further uses for the Panther Jeep as well as the mobile missile system. Of note, talented customizer Ray Murphy has made his own custom versions of these, photos of which can be found in Total Action Force: The Battle Years. Today we can look back at the SAS and everything it meant not only to Action Force fans, but also to fans of the preceding Action Man toy line. It's amazing to think that not only do the toys carry such great desirability in the adult-driven collector's market, but their historical significance carried so much weight for the children who could experience the SAS as a part of the world they lived in at the time.
Because they were so in the public eye, I mean, again, just to give a bit of context around that time, not only did we have that kind of live coverage of the siege, and then you had, the SAS Force, flooding the ranks of Action Man, there was also a movie that was made at the time called Who Dares Wins, which was kind of a dramatized version of the Iranian siege. It certainly wouldn't have been kind of historically accurate. They took a lot of creative liberties with that movie, but it was a great action movie. So being like in the public awareness, it meant that the SAS Force team was always going to get, you know, a really great lineup of figures and vehicles within Action Force and get a lot of real estate in the comics.
Ultimately, the SAS goes way beyond just being something within a toy line. Yes, the iteration we're discussing here is very much an 80s version, but in a way, they were also Action Force's own version of a daring, highly trained Special Mission Force.
Daring, highly trained Special Mission Force.
And that is probably the best thing I can say about them as we hit the home stretch of this particular topic.
Final thoughts on the SAS. I would say that there's a great little sub-team within Action Force. They don't have maybe the kind of the colourful aesthetic of Q Force or Space Force. They've got much more of a military special forces kind of look. And I think that kind of aesthetic definitely is going to, you know, connect with modern collectors of who are into kind of military themed toys. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're still so popular today.
And if you happen to like this video, don't go anywhere just yet. I'm gonna put another Action Force related history video that you can click on right over here, or to have a look at Action Force's American cousin G.I. Joe, you can have a look at this history video right over here. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time. Take care.